In 1964, there was an unbelievable encounter with aliens, allegedly. It's known now as the Cisco Grove UFO encounter. There was actually a book that came out that was published in 2011 called "Aliens in the Forest: The Cisco Grove UFO Encounter," which talked about this. And the guy that it happened to was a guy named Donald Shrum, and he didn't go public with this until basically 2011. This happened in 1964. Now the story was known to people in ufology, right? He presented this story anonymously. He didn't want to give his name though, because of course the story is so wild. I could understand why he didn't want to give his name. But he has never really, over the years, he really didn't profit from this story. He kept it to himself. I mean, he told people about it, but he didn't want his name out in the public, and you could understand why when you hear the story. It's basically, to me, right, some of the craziest UFO stories, like the one that has to be the 1955 Kentucky Goblin Spree, which is something I talked about on the podcast before. And this one right there is right up there with it. I mean, this is probably... if this is true, right, there's a lot to talk about here. But anyway, we'll get into what happened here. Here's an article there's a lot of different articles you could find online about this. But there was a good one on medium.com written by Ken Korzak in August 19th, 2022, and I'm going to read this article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. He gets into all different kinds of what he thinks it might be, and I think you should check it out. Check his article out. I will leave the link for it. You got to check it out. It's a pretty good article. But I'm just going to read the beginning of this article that talks about the event itself. Anyway, the article is called UFOs, Aliens, Mythology, and Man, a case study that shows how both UFO skeptics and UFO advocates have been trapped by a delusional, scientific, and evidence-based approach to explain the phenomenon. In 1964, California man Donald Shrum was an avid hunter who was about to become the hunted. Think of the way a pack of hounds might tree a raccoon or a bear. Well, Shrum would find that table turned on him. But it wouldn't be a dog pack tormenting him as he clung to a branch. It would be aliens. But was it truly aliens, or was it something even more profound and amazing? Anyway, let's read the case here. Overview of the case. The year was 1964. Shrum, then age 26, was bow hunting with some pals in a rugged, high-elevation region of Northern California's Sierra Nevada mountains. This was in the Tahoe National Forest. Shrum became separated from his group and subsequently got lost. As darkness began to fall, he decided to climb a tree to spend the night. He didn't want to get eaten by a mountain lion while sleeping on the ground. After the sun sank, Shrum spied a glowing light in the sky coming toward him in a zigzagging motion. I just want to stop there for a second. I also heard that he did hear noises before the light showed up, and he thought it was a bear, and he had climbed this tree, and then he thought he should stay there in that tree because for safety. But anyway, continuing. After the sun sank, Shrum spied a glowing light in the sky coming toward him in a zigzagging motion. He hoped the light was a rescue helicopter, maybe called by his friends who reported him lost. He climbed down rapidly from his perch to build a fire so he could be spotted from the air. It soon became obvious, however, that this was no helicopter. A stunned Donald Shrum gaped in wonder as a gargantuan cigar-shaped UFO about the size of a 14-story building hovered close and stopped just 50 yards from his position. Even more unnerving, a small scout ship UFO disgorged from the mothership and appeared to land nearby. Now, can you imagine? Imagine you're in the middle of the forest and you're seeing something like this. Can you imagine how scary that would be? Oh my God. Shaken by this remarkable turn of events, Shrum opted to scramble back up into his tree. He was soon glad he did. A few minutes later, 3 weird aliens showed up and sauntered right up to the base of the tree. First came 2 beings that appeared vaguely humanoid. They were about 5 feet tall and wearing silvery uniforms that covered their heads. They sported eyewear Shrum described to look like welding goggles. If this sounds all sort of 1950s black and white science fiction movie-like, just wait until you hear about the 3rd alien. It was like something straight from the cover of an old pulp science fiction magazine. Showing up shortly after the 2 silver-suited humanoids was a metallic robot. It was something like a Hollywood special effects team might have developed for an Eisenhower-era drive-in theater flick. As the robot joined its two ET buddies at the base of the tree, Donald Shrum, his mind blown, could not believe what he was seeing. He said the robot was darker in color and rocked two glowing reddish-orange eyes. Shrum described its mouth as merely a slit-like opening that could drop down like an oven door. Some versions of the story say the aliens and their robot henchman began to shake the tree. Shrum himself later disputed this, saying it never happened. Whatever the case, he knew they obviously wanted to get their hands, claws, on him for reasons he did not care to contemplate. The robot stepped forward and stopped with its back against the tree. It then lowered its jaw using its hand to expose the mouth opening. From this gap came a stream of gas that spread like a mist, enough so to envelope Shrum. This caused him to black out. Despite losing consciousness, Shrum managed to stay in the tree, probably because he had taken the precaution to secure himself to a limb with his belt. When he awoke an indeterminate time later, the aliens remained and seemed determined to bring him down. To fight back, Shrum took out some matches and searched his pockets for scraps of paper. Finding things like his hunting license and dollar bills in his wallet, he lit them on fire and rained little fire bombs down upon his assailants. Let's just stop here for a minute. Could you imagine this? Now you're in a tree. There's two apparent alien beings, at the base of the tree trying to get you to come down. They want to take you away. And there's this giant robot that looks like it's out of a comic book, shooting gas out of its mouth that makes you pass out for a few minutes. Like, what the hell was going on here? This is unlike anything. This is like the Kentucky Goblin Spree. That was unlike anything. That, you never hear anything like this. The creatures that were described, you never heard, you never heard any stories that featured creatures like this, before or after that one incident. And you don't really hear anything like this again. And also, if you think about it, the Pascagoula 1973 case involving those two guys fishing on the Pascagoula River, these beings, a spaceship lands and these three humanoid figures come out, but they're like robots with wrinkled skin and carrots like where the nose is and the ears. I mean, sometimes it seems like there are things out there that are different than the usual, grays and praying mantis and reptilian style beings that people talk about all the time. Anyway, continuing. To fight back, okay, I've already read that part. He then started tearing scraps of his clothing to light on fire. At one point, he set his hat ablaze. It had a goodly amount of hairstyling grease on it, and bombed it down on his assailants. This caused them to jump back momentarily, but it did not dissuade them for long. As it turns out, Shrum also had his 60-pound reflexive bow and 3 arrows with him in the tree. He knocked an arrow and took a shot. He hit the robot dead on in the chest. The steel tip of the arrow sparked as it glanced off the hard surface of the mechanical alien. The arrow strike made a clinking sound, confirming to Shrum that the robot was metallic. Shrum launched the other 2 arrows at the 3 invaders. They ran back to avoid being hit. They weren't ready to give up, however. The robot tried its gas gambit a second time. Once again, the mist came forth and Shrum passed out. When he woke up this time, he was dismayed to see the humanoid aliens attempting to scale the tree. Shrum fended them off by bombing down anything he could find. Broken branches, his old army surplus canteen, whatever he had in his pockets, his wallet, some coins, and this stymied them. A back and forth battle would ensue all night. The 2 humanoids and the robot were later joined by several other aliens as the hellish ordeal wore on. Yet again, the robot unhinged its jaw and deployed its knockout gas. Shrum passed out once again, but the next time he awoke it was dawn and his alien tormentors were gone. Shrum finally climbed down. A while later, he spotted one of his hunting buddies who was searching for him. Shrum shouted out. The hunters were reunited. The others could see their companion was exhausted and dazed. Among the hunting party was a man named Vincent Alvarez. He reported seeing the same UFO described by Shrum, although neither Alvarez nor any of the other men saw aliens. Shrum related the sensational events of the night to his stunned companions and then laid down to sleep for 6 hours. Now, just think about that. That is unbelievable. I mean, if it's real, I mean, you have to wonder. I mean, I guess there's a lot of questions I have here, and some of these questions this writer gets into later on, and I'm not going to get into his opinions on this. But again, that's something you could read for yourself. But I guess I find some of the strange things about this story is that this guy is hiding in a tree. There's this giant cigar-shaped spaceship shows up. A little spaceship flies out of it, and then these little aliens get out of it, and this robot. And apparently, in other versions of this story, there was a second robot that showed up toward the end too. And at one point, these two robots were both standing beneath the tree. I mean, it's just a crazy story, And it sounds like something out of it really does sound like something out of a 50s science fiction movie. But you have to wonder, okay, I guess one of the questions I have is, these aliens have all these powers, right? They have these flying machines, and they're landing in the middle of the forest like this, and they have robots walking around. Why weren't they able to get him out of the tree? Apparently, they really wanted him. Maybe it was because they thought if they wanted to get him down safely, maybe they didn't want to kill him. They wanted him, to examine him like sometimes like aliens like to do. Maybe that's what it was about. Who knows? Anyway, continuing with the story. Although the story of Donald Shrum's encounters soon spread widely within the UFO community, including many of the top researchers of the day, Shrum did not go public with his name for more than 40 years. The story occasionally popped up in various publications and books. It was even dramatized on at least one TV show. One prominent UFO author who wrote about the case is Preston Dennett. He used the anonymous name of Donald Smythe to tell the story in one of his books. Although Dennett retold the story faithfully and accurately, too many others mangled or sensationalized the story, especially the TV dramatization. The producers hid behind the anonymity of the sources and played the story up to make it entertaining for viewers. Even the iconic paranormal researcher John Keel of the Mothman prophecies was said to have botched the story, as did investigators for APRO, the once prominent UFO study organization. Thus, the story became infected with numerous inaccuracies, which were often picked up and repeated by others. The first time Shrum allowed himself to be identified was in an April 2007 article published in the MUFON Journal. That article was titled The Cisco Bow and Arrow Alien Encounter, written by Stephen Reichmuth. However, Shrum's real coming out finally happened when he was 73 years old. He agreed to go on the record with authors No Torres and Ruben Uriarte for their 2011 book Aliens in the Forest, The Cisco Grove UFO Encounter. Yeah, I would highly recommend that book, by the way. Shrum trusted these two writers and hoped the book they wrote would not only tell the story completely, thoroughly, and accurately, but also clear up the considerable misinformation that had spread about the case over the decades. Shrum wanted the book to serve as the authentic and official documentation of the UFO encounter for future generations. I should note that Shrum had previously completed several in-depth interviews with Paul Cerny, then the chairman of MUFON's Bay Area chapter. Also, an in-depth transcript exists of an interview he did with another UFO researcher. This interview was conducted in 1965, a year after the incident. Thus, as it so often happens in sensational UFO cases, the Shrum story became tangled by both good and bad reporting. That only exasperates the inevitable ridicule meted out by skeptics. As usual, they offer the usual band-aid theories along with the standard accusations of fakery and hoaxing. And then there was some Men in Black encounters, which is another interesting aspect to this whole insane story. After the No Torres book was published, Donald Shrum's son, Dan, came forward with further fascinating insights. Dan Shrum was born in 1966, 2 years after his father's encounter. However, he said he was raised knowing my father's story, but it was strict family policy to never speak of it with anyone outside the immediate family. As a young child, Dan recalls many nights being awoken in bed to hear his father screaming out in terror as he suffered nightmares, flashbacks, and classic symptoms of PTSD. He said his father would sometimes sob uncontrollably after his nightly outbursts. Dan said he was too young at the time to understand what was tormenting his father, a man he described as known for his incredible kindness and his strong principles. And sure enough, Like in many of the juiciest UFO stories, the Shrum case has its own Men in Black element. Dan Shrum said that both his father and mother, Judy Shrum, were interviewed by two stiff Air Force officers and on at least two occasions by mysterious Men in Black suits. And get this, on at least one occasion, the Men in Black suits hauled off Donald and Judy to a remote location, once to an abandoned house, where they were interrogated and vaguely threatened if they did not cooperate and also stay silent about the event. And get this also, Dan Shrum said an Air Force team, most likely, later visited the site of the alien encounter and scoured the area looking for clues and cleaned up any evidence they could find at the site, including the remaining scraps of items he threw down at the aliens. Whoever had cleaned the site even raked the soil in the area around the tree. Now he gets into a lot of stuff about what the bunkers are, what's said about this, and there's a lot more to this article, but and his opinion on it. And but I just want to talk about this case here. There's so much to it. I mean, it's just again, it's just another example to me that there could be a lot more going on here than we realize. I mean, there could be other kind of beings. I mean, it sounds incredible. I mean, the kind of robot that he described. I mean, it does sound. It sounds like there was the one Bugs Bunny cartoon I remember when there was a mad scientist where I don't know there was a flood or something, and I remember Bugs Bunny getting lifted off his bed in his rabbit hole, and he ended up in this castle with this crazy looking mad scientist, and this mad scientist had this giant robot, and he was going to put Bugs Bunny's brain inside the robot. I don't know. I'm sure some of you remember this cartoon I'm talking about. And that robot, that's what this sounds like. It sounds like that robot with the square jaw. And I mean, it sounds like the same kind of thing. And there were some other science fiction movies in the 50s that featured robots. But you have to wonder, like, what the hell is going on here? I mean, seriously, what the hell is going on here? Now, I guess the story is strange in so many ways. I mean, you would think that these aliens would still have the ability, even if you're hiding up in the top of a tree, you would think that they would have the ability to get you down. I mean, if they have the ability to fly around in gigantic football field sized cylinders, and that also house little flying saucers, right? I mean, you would think that they would have the technology to get a living specimen out of the top of a tree. I don't understand what happened here. I mean, you have to wonder. I mean, I don't think the guy's lying. Now, apparently, from what I've read about this, the guy never did any kind of drugs or anything like that. I mean, it was the 60s, but still, this guy was apparently a clean and sober type of guy. And people that knew him, he was an upstanding sort of guy. So why would you come up with the story? Now, he didn't want his name out there, but this was what he said happened. And you have to wonder. I mean, again, you look at the Kentucky Goblin Spree. I believe that one happened because there was over 10 witnesses to that. I mean, there was over 10 witnesses. I saw some of the witnesses talking about this. I know I saw at least one interview that happened like over 30 years after the event, and the one guy he was only 12 years old at the time, and he was saying, yeah, that's what happened. That he talked about what the beings looked like. There was these little short beings that showed up at this farmhouse in the middle of the woods in Kentucky, and was basically terrorizing this family, throughout the night. And it was just such a crazy story. But again, you have to wonder. It seems like there were more than just. To me, it seems like there's more than just one type of alien showing up, or maybe they're just playing games with us. Who knows? But the idea that that they're sending out robots. Here's the other thing. Maybe this is something that happens. Maybe they study us and they see what we imagine as. This is something I always wonder. Like say, when these aliens, they're probably paying attention to what we're doing. They probably, like again, I was talking earlier about how they probably know more about us than we know about ourselves. And when they from a distance, from outside the box, they look at what we find, what we watch for entertainment. And back in the 50s, there were movies with robots and cartoons with robots and comic books with robots. So maybe they make these things look like that, so they match with our idea of what we expect. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different. I don't know. It's just crazy. This is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard in my life. Honest to God, and I at the same time, I have trouble not believing it because I mean, this guy stood by his story for all these years. He didn't want to. he never like made money off this story. He kept his name was anonymous. He didn't want to, people to know who he was, but he did share his story. He thought it was important to tell people. And so, there's no reason to lie. And I have to look at it from my own viewpoint. I've seen things, I've seen one of these beings in my room when I was a kid. I saw an alien being in my room when I was a kid. I saw, on a fishing trip in 1994, I saw a flying saucer along with a buddy when we were fishing. I talk about these things all the time. There's strange things that happen to me too. Not this strange, but again, it doesn't mean it can't happen. And maybe they do have robots that look like that. I mean, who knows? I don't know what the answer is. But again, I think it's a fascinating story. And I highly recommend that book, Aliens in the Forest, the Cisco Grove UFO Encounter.